Cześć, nazywam się Radek Orszewski i zapraszam Was na podcast Kanban przy kawie. Witam Was serdecznie przy okazji 17 już odcinka podcastu Kanban przy kawie. Dziś będziemy rozmawiać o czymś, co powiedziałbym właśnie, znaczy bardzo wiele rzeczy dla bardzo wielu osób, co jest terminem często używanym, często nadużywanym. Zacznijmy jednak od jakiejś historyjki, od jakiegoś storytellingu, chciałoby się powiedzieć po staropolsku. Co roku pojawia się taki dokument jak Annual State of Agile. Ten dokument jest opracowywany przez firmę, w tej chwili już nie bezpośrednio version 1, ale przez firmę powiązaną z producentem oprogramowania do zarządzania właśnie procesem wytwarzania takich produktów. Może wziąć w nim udział właściwie każdy, to znaczy to nie jest tak, że jest to proces jakiegoś wyboru, ma miejsce kto tych odpowiedzi udziela. Zasadniczo każdy z Was może się co roku do takiej ankiety zgłosić, a więc może jest tam trochę przekłamań, może nie, ale na pewno jest to dokument, który pojawia się już kilkanaście lat i rzeczywiście pewnego rodzaju trendy da się w nim zaobserwować. Mnie osobiście jedną z rzeczy, które bardzo lubię co roku jakby zaglądać, po co lubię zaglądać tego raportu, jest taki wykres kołowy, taki pie chart, który pokazuje udział różnych metodyk, frameworków organizacji pracy. Nie jest pewnie zaskoczeniem, że większość tego torcika co roku zajmuje Scrum, natomiast co jest na drugim miejscu? Jeśli myślicie, że Kanban, to radzę zajrzeć do tego raportu. Otóż nie. Drugie miejsce z 10% udziałem zajmuje Scrumban. Scrumban? Co to takiego? No właśnie. Czy Scrumban to jakaś hybryda? Czy Scrumban to jeszcze Scrum? Czy już może nie? Czy to już Kanban? Czy może jeszcze nie? A może jest w tym w ogóle więcej leanu? Może jest w tym więcej kultury continuous improvement, kultury Kaizen? No właśnie. Jak podejść do tego? Przede wszystkim, jeśli ktoś chce albo chce wiedzieć, skąd ten termin najczęściej, można powiedzieć, jest przywoływane źródło tego terminu, to jest to książka. Jest to książka, która pojawiła się w roku 2008-2009, zaraz się tego dowiemy z rozmowy, której autorem jest Corey Ladas. No właśnie, i jeśli porozmawiać o Scrumbanie, no to z kim lepiej, jak nie z samym autorem. Zapraszam Was więc dzisiaj na kolejny anglojęzyczny wywiad z Corey Ladasem. Muszę powiedzieć, że jest to wywiad kontrowersyjny. W wywiadzie tym dostanie się każdemu. Dostanie się i Scrumowi, dostanie się sprint goalom, dostanie się retrospektywą, ale dostanie się też i metodzie Kanban. Wszystkim po trochu, nie bez przyczyny. Myślę, że to może być otrzeźwiające. Corey oczywiście reflektuje się, że to jest tylko jego wyłączna opinia, ale myślę, że z całej tej rozmowy na pewno wyniknie to, że Scrumban, tak często jak różne rzeczy Scrumbanem są nazywane i pewnie jak wiele różnych rzeczy osoby odpowiadające w tej ankiecie Annual State of Agile rozumieją jako Scrumban, wcale tym Scrumbanem nie są, albo po prostu używają nazwy na coś, co nie do końca działa, bo Scrumban Korea działał. Zapraszam więc do wysłuchania wywiadu. Po tym wywiadzie trochę słów komentarza ode mnie na temat również moich obserwacji, co ja w swojej pracy konsultanta czy coacha, a czasami też trenera widzę jako nazywane Scrumbanem i czy to działa, czy nie działa, czy pomaga, czy nie pomaga, jak można pójść w stronę Scrumbanu, który rzeczywiście byłby czymś, co czerpie z tej podstawy, może z tego Scruma, ale idzie gdzieś dalej. Zapraszam do wysłuchania wywiadu. So today I have a special guest for our podcast. I thought about recording an episode about Scrumban, and then I thought, man, there's no better person to talk about Scrumban than Corey Ladas, and here he is. Here's Corey with us. Corey, so let's start with introduction. If there's anyone who doesn't know you or doesn't recognize the name connected with the topic of Scrumban, be so kind to introduce yourself to our audience.
My connection to Scrumban is that I created the first Scrumban project in 2004. Then I wrote an essay called Scrumban in 2008, which I then developed into a book called Scrumban in 2009, which was also the first book about Kanban systems for software development.
So even before the so well-known Blue Book, right, by David Anderson, which was strictly about Kanban.
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting bit of history there that I think also some people probably have forgotten with time, is that in 2008, David Anderson, Jim Benson, and I were business partners. That the first version of the modus cooperandi consulting firm was that partnership. So, I mean, I wrote the Scrumban essay, sitting across the hall from David's office.
Mm-hmm.
All three of us had a lot of interesting history that brought us all together in that place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you created the term, you published the book. Scrumban was just one of many essays that you can find in this book. The book had like a longer title that it's about Kanban systems for lean software development. So I would say lots of, for me personally, the most important concepts. So being lean and Kanban systems, pull systems, etc. If I would ask you, what was the origin of it? So if our audience, if our listeners haven't read it, of course we recommend it very, very much. It's a story, right? It's a kind of storytelling of a team which is working with some constraints of Scrum framework, and there's a decision, I would say conscious, to look for others' way of working. If you could give us some context about the team and situation and constraints and the way you selected or you chose to follow.
The idea of the Scrumban story is that you can use Scrum as a platform. The advantage of Scrum is that it's simple. Mm-hmm. And everyone understands it. Are the practices of Scrum good? They're good to the degree that they're simple and they're a common understanding. Mm-hmm. My feeling at the time was that, as simple and underpowered as Scrum is, it's enough of a platform to adopt a strategy of continuous improvement. And that rather than feed people another manual, another recipe about how to do another proprietary process, that the approach would be start with something very simple that everybody understands, and then draw from a body of knowledge like theory of constraints or design for Six Sigma or lean or whatever, to incorporate practices that address problems that you have for the problem that you're working on. Mm-hmm. I saw at the time a lot of tension in the Scrum community between people who were claiming that, there was a rigid set of rules that you had to follow, and that if you're not doing Scrum by the book, that you're doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that idea of doing it wrong is totally wrong-headed. That Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber, they didn't write a book about you. They didn't write a book about your business. They don't know anything about you, mm-hmm. right? And so you have to take those things as a starting point, as a general guideline for how to get organized, but then you have to take it somewhere else. And, right, so if you take seriously the Scrum idea of inspect and adapt, well, what is it that you're inspecting and adapting, right? If you're going to change something, what is it that you're going to change, mm-hmm. right? The practices and beliefs of Scrum are absolutely as much of a target as anything else you might be inspired to change. And I would argue, since the practices of Scrum are pretty mediocre, they're ripe targets for change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you started this evolutionary way of looking for better ways of doing software. We could maybe find a reference like this to Agile Manifesto, and you decided to loosen some of the constraints, we could say, of Scrum framework. And how did it go?
Well, one thing is that there are different interpretations of what Scrum is. Mm-hmm. So if you go back and look at the Harvard Business Review paper or some of the early things that Sutherland wrote about Scrum, what that's describing is something that's pretty different than what later became the sort of canonical, sprint goals and product owner version of Scrum. And I would argue that those early interpretations of Scrum are better. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would argue that something like, so if you look at the original HBR paper, right, it's got this idea of overlapping sprints. Well, mm-hmm. I would argue that the Scrumban process that's described in the book is an implementation of overlapping sprints. So I could almost argue that Scrumban is more Scrum than Scrum is.
Okay. For those of you who doesn't know or haven't read it, I guess you're referring to the HBR article by Takeuchi and Nonaka from 1986, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So this is a free paper which you can find online. So if you think like Scrum or doing Agile is a new thing, we could say go Google for it. It's dated 1986, so it's probably much older than some of our listeners, who believe they do new things. And you're right. There's great inspiration there how to build products. With overlapping sprints, with super short feedback loops and cross-functional teams and whatever else, which didn't have some fancy names back then.
Right. So I'd love to riff on that a little bit because it bothers me that I feel that a lot of history has been lost over the last 20 years, sort of in service of the creation of this agile religion. The fact is that a lot of what we think of as contemporary ideas in software development are decades old. And the people who first proposed those ideas are largely forgotten about. Like you ask the average agile enthusiast today, who is Harlan Mills or who is Tom Gilb, like you'll get a blank stare. But those are the people who thought of these things in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. And I would argue that some of those older methods are superior to their descendants, right? Because they were thought of by better people. Mm-hmm. And, they're later sort of interpreted and, for marketing purposes into something that's dumbed down and simplified. And, if dumbed down and simplified works for you, that's great. But if you're genuinely interested in this stuff and the purpose of your work matters, it's worthwhile looking into the real history of things. I know that's an edgy take, but
but it's an interesting topic. I think the other interesting topic is what you mentioned in our writing before recording this podcast was about when to decide for the evolutionary way, right? So I keep seeing people, trainers, consultants, coaches who are saying, yes, there is the whole world of lean, Kanban, and whatever else out there. But before you start going there, you need to practice perfect Scrum. You need to do the Scrum right, and then you're ready. Then you're adult enough to start selecting maybe tools, building your own toolkit out of different methods or frameworks. There's very often this reference to this, martial arts Shuhari model, right? At first you need to, blindly follow the master and master the movements, kicks and whatnot, right? And only then you can design your own style. The way I understand it is, so please correct me or say how you see it, that you basically started looking for improvements relatively early. I don't think you see it as like, you need to really practice one thing for years before you go somewhere else.
Right. I guess, the software development world has this way of getting trapped in its its own cliches. You know, the shuhari thing has some value, but that's not where I was coming from. I think that statistical process control is a more interesting frame to come from. You know, something like the PDCA or PDSA cycle, that Deming is a more interesting antecedent to these ideas than, you know, anything that's come out of the agile world. Yeah, so that idea of a simple platform like Scrum, and then, you know, experimentation is just you know, simple statistical process control, or, you know, again, that's an idea that comes out of, you know, directly out of Toyota production system, the and encore, the, you know, quality circles, the idea that, here we go, right? Like the idea that the object of inspection. So one thing about lean, interesting lean practices, is this idea of 100% successive inspection, right? That everybody is responsible not only for the quality of work that they produce, but also for the quality of work that they consume. And that purpose of inspection is not to find defects in the product, it's to find defects in the process.
And we don't see it much with very prescriptive methods, right?
Yeah, so if you think that that method is about following some incantation, and if you get all the words and inflections right, then the result will magically appear, that's not helpful, right? You have to apply process with intention, with purpose, right? It's what you're doing is not important. Why you're doing it is what's important, right? And so you have to be able to map the practices of the process that you're using back to the specifics of your people and your business. So unless you know exactly why you're doing the stuff in Scrum, you're not going to get a good result of it. Now, I like Scrum anyway because it's so simple that it should be pretty easy to map those practices back to why you might use them. But in in that mapping, you may also discover things that are not a good fit or things that you don't like. So in my case, right, the genesis of Scrumban was, I hate sprint planning. I hate it. It's just, I find it. It's not because I'm, not a qualified engineer, or, that, I'm lacking in some skill or not a good team player or anything like that. I just don't like it. I find it personally very distasteful. And I asked myself, why is this necessary? And the answer that I came up with is, it's not necessary. If you don't like sprint planning, you don't have to do it. There are other options, and you should be free to choose those options. And that's a very simple thing that I'd like to believe that a lot of people can relate to. So for me, it was a very simple matter of, I've been doing Scrum for a while. I just can't do sprint planning again. I can't do it. I can't, and so I thought of a different way. And once I did, I, started to realize that I was kind of unlocking a path into something else. And a part of that was because at the time I was really immersed in lean stuff, right? The idea didn't just come to me out of the blue. And part of that was because there were groups inside Microsoft who were working on lean software development practices at the time. And by working on, I mean they were shipping major products like Microsoft Office and Visual Studio using lean software development processes, and very consciously so. At the time, I was like sort of a vacuum cleaner of methodology. I was going out and learning as much as I could about every industry and every body of practice that I could find, trying to find solutions, to nasty problems like, how do we get Windows Vista out the door?
Jak pamiętacie, obiecałem sobie eksperymentować z formą podcastu w postaci różnego rodzaju dżingli i przerywników. To dziś będzie nowego typu dżingiel, będzie reklama. Jak wiecie, poza produkcją podcastu na co dzień zajmuję się przede wszystkim konsultingiem i coachingiem, pracując z klientami w Polsce, w Europie, jeżeli chodzi o wdrożenia metody Kanban, jeżeli chodzi o transformację formy pracy. Natomiast jestem też oczywiście akredytowanym trenerem metody Kanban i chciałem, jeśli o tym jeszcze nie słyszeliście, powiedzieć, że od całkiem niedawna wszystkie już szkolenia dotąd oferowane w formie stacjonarnej przez Kanban University dostępne są również w formie zdalnej. Nie jest to absolutnie szkolenie, na którym pokazujemy komuś przez 8 czy 16 godzin, a więc 2 dni szkoleniowe slajdy. Są to szkolenia bardzo interaktywne, gdzie pracujemy w małych grupach, pracujemy nad konkretnymi case'ami, gdzie zdarzają się zadania domowe, gdzie musimy może przynieść swoje własne przypadki i poddać je w jakiś sposób dyskusji. Co jest ciekawe, szkolenia te zostały całkowicie przebudowane właśnie z postaci takich 2 długich zwykle dni pracy na formę, która jest przyjazna, no powiedziałbym, współczesnym czasom pracy z domu. I dlatego chciałem opowiedzieć o tej formie szkoleń, ponieważ te szkolenia, te dotąd 2-dniowe szkolenia rozbite zostały na 4 sesje szkoleniowe, a więc mamy 4 poranki albo 4 popołudnia po 4 godziny, w których pracujemy nad konkretnymi modułami. Zaczynamy od takiej sesji, powiedziałbym, zapoznawczo-technicznej, a więc w ogóle tego poznania i grupy, i tego, jak będziemy pracować. Jest to forma, którą już miałem okazję sprawdzić kilka razy na grupach również w Polsce i która, muszę powiedzieć, no nie tylko moim zdaniem, ale uczestników bardzo sprawnie działa. Przede wszystkim jest więcej czasu na to, żeby to przemyśleć. Nie jest to oczywiście tak męczące, jak cały dzień spędzony przed komputerem. Wiele osób też chwali sobie to, że może to podzielić, można powiedzieć, jeszcze z kilkoma godzinami pracy zawodowej, zajęciem się dziećmi, domem, żonglerką tymi wszystkimi rzeczami, kiedy druga osoba w domu też prowadzi biuro innej firmy. Jeśli więc jesteście zainteresowani zgłębianiem metody Kanban, tego jak tą pracę przy wykorzystaniu metody Kanban organizować, to zapraszam serdecznie na tego typu szkolenia. Najbliższe edycje już w lipcu i w sierpniu. Szczegółowe terminy znajdziecie na stronie leanagile.ninja oraz na moich mediach społecznościowych. Do zobaczenia. We are now in 2020, and every year we see the annual state of Agile, and people actually report there what's the method that you use. Of course, we see a huge part of the pie described as Scrum, but Scrumban is there, and Scrumban is there, I would say, every year. I keep meeting people who say like, oh, we do the Scrumban, and I'm asking what does the Scrumban is for you, and then they start describing different kind of hybrids, some kind of Frankensteinish approach that they don't drop any of the Scrum practices, but at the bottom of the board we have this lane for bugs or that, so we do both at the same time. Then I'm asking what kind of Kanban you do. Do you have the whip limits? Do you have the pull system? Not really. Yeah. So for me, the problem is like many people are using the word or the term Scrumban, but sorry to say it, dysfunctional approaches are called this way, because it's not like you just said, do something differently, drop maybe one of the events, but still deliver in a predictable way, good quality products, right? Products which are wanted by the customers. I guess these people who say they do Scrumban, in majority, they still have problems with, defining what's the good product and what's wanted product, etc., and how to deliver it in a predictable way. How do you see it? Do you also feel like the term is, well, let's not be afraid of the word, abused or misused?
Scrumban has certainly been abused. And to some degree, I allowed some of that to happen. Mm-hmm. Some of it is inevitable, right? Like there are things that once they're unleashed in the world, they grow beyond control. People are just going to do what they're going to do with it. I've also been pretty hands-off about it over the last few years, sort of, giving people space to take it to where they want it to go. My hope was that, other people would take up the would understand and would take up the fight and would, steer things in a good direction. And some of that happens.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I should have followed up with more information about what it was that I meant, what it was that I intended, or just my opinions about how people should use that idea and where they should take it. The bad news is that I didn't do that. The good news is that I am doing it right now.
Can you tell us something more about how are you trying to, demystify the Scrumban these days?
So I am presently working on a new book, which is very much a sequel to the Scrumban book that is much more systematic and much more detailed about the ideas that were in the original Scrumban book.
Mm-hmm.
There are going to be some surprises in there that some people will like and some people won't. But the new book is much more grounded in theory than the first book was. And so I hope that's helpful.
Okay. Any dates that you can, tease to us? Because it sounds really interesting to get our hands on it.
Finished version of the book, first edition, probably a year out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds really interesting. So I keep my fingers crossed, and I'm pretty sure lots of people who are going to hear what you just described, that's going to be in this book, will also be waiting for it to be out. Okay. You let the term live on its own. Lots of people, I would say, adopted or put some different ideas under the hood or umbrella of Scrumban. If I would ask you now, how do you define it in, 1-2 sentences? Yeah, you said about the starting with Scrum. You said about lots of inspirations from Lean, Deming, PDCA, etc. How do you describe it? If you would be asked, to write a Wikipedia, definition, yeah, what would it be?
Something I've said before is that the weak interpretation is that if you are already practicing Scrum, that you can begin incorporating flow production ideas by a continuous improvement process. That you have the basic condition to attempt continuous improvement, and that there are bodies of knowledge like theory of constraints or Toyota production system, or more importantly, Reinertsen,
Mm-hmm.
that you can pull ideas from and incorporate them into your existing practice. That's the weak interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
The strong interpretation of Scrumban is that if you're doing something totally different or you're starting from scratch, starting with implementing Scrum first is a good move, is a good first step.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because it's simple, it's because it's widely supported and widely agreed upon. It's, of course it's not a great process. It doesn't have to be a great process. If you're starting a new project or a new team, you're not going, you shouldn't plan on being great right off the bat anyway. So while you're stumbling around figuring out, how to work together, start with something simple. Can I say that, that may come as a surprise to some people who are interested in Kanban, who are interested in Lean, the idea that you would start, a Lean software development process by adopting Scrum first.
Mm-hmm.
That might seem odd to some people. Now, I would say if you knew anything about Lean, it's not odd at all. But if what you know about Lean software development or about Kanban is sort of, how it's represented in Trello, or how it's represented sort of by Kanban method people at a conference, that is a very skewed, narrow view about what Lean is and about what Lean software development is. So my point of view, and of course it's my point of view, right, is that Scrum is actually a perfectly natural, perfectly consistent starting point for Lean software development. But it's a starting point. It's not the end.
Okay. So naturally, I think it makes sense. Like if you're familiar with the concept of what Scrum.org called professional Scrum with Kanban, right? So I guess like two plus years ago, they introduced a new part of their curriculum where they basically apply some of the Kanban practices and metrics and inject them into the Scrum sprints. Are you familiar with it?
I don't know a lot about the contents. I know that that exists, and I know the people involved, but
yeah, because it's interesting that also this is also, I would say, you called just a moment ago you used the word skewed, right? And I believe it's an also different flavor of it, right? Like we say it's 100% Scrum, we would feel bad if you dismount any part of the Scrum framework, as it's like really now strongly defined, but we allow you, let's just say, to use some of the Kanban practices and metrics inside the Scrum sprint. But please do not mess with the sprints.
Yeah, so obviously I have a very different opinion, which is that the Scrum framework as it has evolved is already illegitimate, and that it's deviated so far from the original concept of Scrum that it's become something else, and it's become something else that's not so good.
Anyway, if I would ask you, okay, there's a team which is practicing Scrum. Maybe they have like this personal dislike of one event, like you described yours to sprint plannings, right? And if they look for a relatively safe way of experimenting, relatively safe way of going evolutionary forward, what would be your hint?
It depends upon the team, but a common area of difficulty, if a Scrum team is genuinely cross-functional, right? If the team is genuinely capable of delivering a feature from end to end, always necessarily going to be the case, and you're working under a time box constraint, here's my answer. I would say the very, very first thing that most Scrum teams should do is abandon the sprint goal. That the sprint goal is working against your interests.
Could you elaborate more on it? Because some people say, well, sprint goal gives you the direction, so you can be agile, you can be flexible as long as something doesn't compromise or put this goal at risk. So some people say it's a relief because we can change the scope, we can change the priorities, right? As long as they are in line with the goal.
Yes. So sprint goals kill throughput and they create thrashing. If your team is truly cross-functional, then sprint goals create thrashing, where some people are busy at the beginning and some people are busy at the end. And it's, this is a purely sort of mechanical, hydraulic kind of throughput problem where you've created this artificial batching constraint. But just from a purely operational point of view, right, they create this forced pipeline stall. That's not flow, right? If you're turning the faucet on and off, once every week, that's not continuous. That's not flow. So I'd argue that, right, that is the big lesson of the Toyota production system, right? That it's flow production is the basic condition of continuous improvement, right? That there's an immediate sort of in the present logic of about controlling inventories and yada yada about flow production, but that's not the real prize. The real prize of flow production is that it creates a foundation for continuous improvement. It creates the circumstances where continuous improvement is possible, right? That's why you should pursue flow. It's not about making things better in the present. It's about the possibility of making things better in the future. Look, if you're doing, 2-week sprints and you're having a retrospective and you're talking about something that happened 10 days ago, that's too late. I'm sure that there are effective retrospectives out there in the world, but most of them are not. And, the root cause of bad retrospectives is sprint goals.
Yeah, I think we have the point about retrospectives. I also see it. We talk about things too late, and very often we don't have time to plan an experiment following the PDCA cycle that you mentioned, right? Because we are like hurrying for another sprint, for defining another sprint goal and whatnot. Yeah, it leads to multiple instances of retrospectives which do not lead to any tangible improvement, even not to actions leading to improvement. And it just, I don't know, people are fed up with approach like this. Yeah, we've been just venting, we've been just talking, but there's no follow-up action.
Yeah, so that's part of the magic of WIP limits and the value of inserting a WIP limit, into a Scrum framework is that work in process is a leading indicator. Problems in workflow show up early as accumulations of inventory. So it's the earliest possible signal that something is going wrong. And that's the time to take action, not in 2 weeks, now.
That's also what I very often hear about people, spending lots of time analyzing the cumulative flow diagrams, right? But it's looking at the past. And if we would act instantly, during the daily meeting or something like this, we could prevent it from happening.
Look, one of my gripes about Kanban method is about how closely the WIP limits are bound to a visual control. That's a two-edged sword, right? The good thing is that made Kanban method easier to understand. The bad thing is that those things don't need to be connected, right? There's no real reason to anchor WIP limits to their representation on a whiteboard. It's not all that effective of a way to do it anyway, and yet it's easy to understand, and so it caught on. But the good thing about that is that by building something like a daily stand-up around the whiteboard, everybody can see how things are playing out in real time, and it's that ability to visualize the current state of the work in a public environment, or in a software tool. But it's that ability to see sort of traffic forming in real time that I think is a lot of the power of adding WIP limits to Scrum.
Yeah, that helps many teams. I believe it's also important, especially these days where lots of teams were forced to work remotely. So of course we record this conversation during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? I had a conversation with Jim Benson some weeks ago. We also spoke about that, how the visualization, even at the personal level, can help allow yourself or people in the team to manage the flow or optimize for the flow of work instead of this, like you said, having front loaded work and then dealing with lots of late work for other people in the team. Thank you very much for this conversation. I hope that we demystified by these couple of minutes of conversation some concept of what's behind Scrumban, what was the story, how is it maybe still misunderstood. Tyle wywiadu z Coreyem. Muszę przyznać, że nie był to łatwy wywiad. Czasami zdarzały nam się gdzieś dygresje na bardzo różne tematy, które może nie znajdowały się w ogólnej agendzie tego wywiadu. Gdzieś tam przygotowywaliśmy się do niego oczywiście wymieniając mailami, wiadomościami dotyczącymi tego, o czym chcemy porozmawiać. Ja osobiście bardzo polubiłem Coreya w takim kontakcie, można powiedzieć, osobistym, choć oczywiście zdalnym, bo myślę, że jest to człowiek, który jest bardzo oddany, można powiedzieć, takiej etycznemu podejściu i idei tego, jak my tą pracę w ogóle chcemy organizować. No, jak wiecie już z wywiadu, należy on do takiej wielkiej trójki osób, które z tym Kanbanem od samego początku pracowały. No, sam ten podcast zaczynał się oczywiście od wywiadu z Davidem Andersonem, który jakby skupił się wokół tworzenia metody Kanban. Przed kilkoma tygodniami mieliśmy Jima Bensona, więc osobę, która poszła bardziej w praktykę, jeżeli chodzi o taką wiedzę teoretyczną, czy jakąś taką metodykę pracy, no to oczywiście jest bezwzględnie wiązany z personal Kanban, a więc tym podejściem do zarządzania jakby swoją zajętością oraz efektywnością pracy. Corey poszedł gdzieś w stronę konsultingu, może właśnie trochę inną stronę. No i tak jak się zreflektował w tym wywiadzie, stworzył tego Scrumbana jako termin, stworzył ten Scrumban, poszedł z nim, można powiedzieć, tylko kilka lat do przodu, a więc od momentu tego zespołu, o którym opisuje, o którym opowiada w wywiadzie, do tego momentu, kiedy wydał tą książkę i rzeczywiście jakby zanurzył się w swoją pracę, niekoniecznie dbał o to, żeby iść, można powiedzieć, w świat i albo, nie wiem, reklamować to, albo rzeczywiście, no właśnie odkłamywać to, co jako ten Scrumban zostaje rozumiany. Dlaczego ja się zdecydowałem na ten temat? To ja muszę powiedzieć, że w swojej pracy właśnie konsultingowo-coachingowej bardzo często spotykam się z organizacjami, które mówią, no my robimy taki Scrumban. No i ja właśnie wtedy pytam, co to jest i trochę jak w tym wywiadzie powiedziałem, słyszę bardzo często, że jest to jakaś tablica Scrumowa, w której ten Scrum nie do końca działał, nie do końca też był Scrumem, jeżeli chodzi o takie ortodoksyjne podejście. Ale nie o to chodzi, że on nie był ortodoksyjny. On nie rozwiązywał problemów. On nie rozwiązywał problemów przeładowania pracy. On nie rozwiązywał problemów dostarczania regularnie wartości. Nie było też, można powiedzieć, skupienia na tym, co ten zespół ma robić, a jednocześnie pewnie zalewanie, tak kolokwialnie mówiąc, sprintów pod korek, co powodowało, że zaczęto szukać jakiejś alternatywy i ja, gdybym miał tak powiedzieć, co najczęściej widzę jako nazywane Scrumbanem, to jest właśnie jakaś taka niepełna forma Scruma, ale no właśnie trzeba tutaj od razu powiedzieć, niepełna z tego względu, że tak jak Corey miał jakąś awersję do planowania albo po prostu na którymś etapie dojrzałości tego zespołu to planowanie nie było już potrzebne, było jakąś nadmiarową czynnością, nie przynoszącą wartości. Raczej tutaj ten niepełny Scrum wynika z tego, że właśnie albo mamy problemy z tym ownershipem, albo mamy problemy z tym fokusem, no a jednocześnie każe nam się pracować nad takimi rzeczami ciągłymi i z tego też względu zaczynamy poszukiwać tych alternatyw, czyli właśnie dodania sobie jakiegoś swimlane'a na tablicy, w której umieszczamy te tikety płynące, można powiedzieć, niezależnie od sprintów. Nazwanie takiej sytuacji Scrumbanem no niczego nie rozwiązuje, poza tym, że mamy nazwę na to, jak pracujemy, ponieważ no ani ten Scrum w postaci takiej iteracyjnej, silnie zatimeboxowanej nie do końca działa, dlatego że gdzieś nam potrafi umknąć duża część naszej mocy przerobowej, naszej przepustowości, naszej dostępności na te rzeczy gdzieś robione równolegle. No a z drugiej strony też te rzeczy dostarczane tym przyszytym do tablicy Kanbanem, no też nie są dostarczane, dlatego że zwykle, no, odnosząc się do definicji, jest to po prostu tablica Kanban, a nie system Kanban, nie jest to system pool, nie jest to system, w którym mamy określone limity pracy w toku, które rzeczywiście pozwalają nam dostarczać w pewien przewidywalny sposób. No i jak chciałoby się powiedzieć, może najlepszy z dwojga, no tutaj pewnie najgorszy z dwojga, tak? Bo jakby bardzo często takie zespoły, no mimo tego, że mają jakieś elementy Scruma, pewnie takie bardziej, powiedziałbym, na zasadzie słownictwa i wydarzeń oraz pewnych praktyk, które nie wiem, czy zespoły do końca rozumieją, ale nie chcę tutaj krytykować, bo to pewnie by zależało od zespołu. No z drugiej strony mają już takie wrażenie, powiedziałbym, no Kanban, tak, znamy, to jest kawałek naszego Scrumbana, tak, czy Scrumbanu. No nie wiem, wydaje mi się, że mimo wszystko nie. Wydaje mi się, że po prostu byłoby fajnie, gdyby zdecydować się w którąś stronę pójść. Natomiast to, o czym opowiada Corey w wywiadzie, no to jest na pewno ścieżka zespołu, który rzeczywiście nie porzucił tego planowania i nie porzucił tej iteracyjności, dlatego że ona była niewygodna, tylko dlatego, że rzeczywiście zespół doszedł do, można powiedzieć, pewnej dojrzałości, w której rzeczywiście to skupienie na flow, skupienie na tym przepływie wartości jest możliwe do zrealizowania w inny sposób, tak? Zwróćcie proszę uwagę, że w tym wywiadzie mówi, no porzuciliśmy planowanie, ale poszukaliśmy czegoś innego, poszukaliśmy czegoś w zamian. No właśnie takie coś w zamian oferuje choćby metoda Kanban, jeżeli chodzi o replenishment, tak? A więc o to, że możemy tą kolejkę najważniejszych, najbardziej wartościowych zadań dla zespołu, elementów pracy po prostu w różny, albo kadencyjny, albo on demand sposób uzupełniać. No ale to musi wynikać przede wszystkim z rozumienia tego, co my chcemy osiągnąć, dlaczego my to robimy. Tak jak Corey podkreśla to w wywiadzie, no fajnie jest rozumieć pewnie, co robimy, ale jeszcze istotniejsze jest rozumienie dlaczego, po co robimy rzeczy tak, a nie inaczej, co chcemy dzięki temu osiągnąć, to właściwie wynika z tego dlaczego. Co jeszcze? No na pewno warto zaprosić Was do przeczytania tej książki. Tak jak powiedziałem w wywiadzie, ona ma taki podtytuł Kanban Systems for Lean Software Development. Rzeczywiście jest tam bardzo sporo o teorii kolejek, jest tam bardzo sporo o teorii ograniczeń, jest bardzo sporo odniesień do Deminga, więc do klasyków Leanu, do państwa popędików, a więc osób, które ten Lean, można powiedzieć, przeszczepiły na pole software developmentu. Jeśli dane Wam będzie trafić na tą książkę, to gorąco polecam. Natomiast jeśli kogoś rozczarowało to, że w dzisiejszym odcinku nie pojawiła się, Corey udzielił jakiejś takiej miękkiej definicji tego Scrumbanu, definicja tego, jak to robić, no to ja bym powiedział, po prostu się zastanówcie jako zespół, dlaczego coś jest dla nas w Scrumie niewygodne, dlaczego chcielibyśmy robić coś z Kanbanu, coś z flow. Jeśli potrafimy w dobry sposób uzasadnić to dlaczego, jesteśmy w stanie temu dlaczego podporządkować jakieś co, a więc co robimy w zamian za coś, a nie tylko, że ujmujemy coś, co jest dla nas niewygodne, czy coś, co jest dla nas może już niewartościowe. Zastanówmy się, czym to zastąpimy. Zastanówmy się, jak to można podjąć z innej strony, w inny sposób. Słuchajcie, chyba tyle na dzisiaj. W samej rozmowie jest dużo mięsa, które nawet jeśli się z nim nie zgadzacie, to myślę, że jest fajnym, można powiedzieć, stymulatorem do przemyśleń. A więc zastanówmy się, czy my też nie wchodzimy gdzieś w to mechanistyczne podejście, czy nasz proces właśnie nie jest chociażby nieefektywny z takiego punktu widzenia mechaniki przepływu, o której mówi Corey. I weźmy z tego coś, ażeby rzeczywiście to, jak pracujemy, zrobić trochę lepszym. Ja przypominam, nazywam się Radek Orszewski i dziękuję Wam serdecznie za wysłuchanie kolejnego 17 już odcinka podcastu Kanban przy kawie. Do usłyszenia, cześć!